Good evening. Welcome to the University of Washington School of Law. This is our largest classroom. My name is Quansheng Zhao. I'm an associate professor at the law school. I'm the director of the Asian Law Center. Professor Zhao, welcome to our school. It's an honor to have you here. I also want to thank my colleagues, Professor Ken Pyle and David Bachman, for being the commentators tonight. It's always our great pleasure to work with Jackson School, our colleagues across the campus in co-sponsoring events like this. A few months ago, I had the pleasure of working with Zhiqin Gao, the president of a student organization called Committee on China-U.S. Dialogue. Zhiqin and his team secured funding from the Confucius Institute for a series of lectures like what we have today. So he will introduce our speaker, followed by Professor Zhao's lecture. Around 4:55, so that's about 50 minutes of lecture. About 4:55, I will invite Professor Bachman and Pyle to share their thoughts with us in response to the lecture. And then around 5:15, we will have a Q&A session. So that's when you have an opportunity to ask burning questions. Want to give you a little bit background of our Asian Law Center. We are one of the earliest centers in the United States, focusing on Asian law studies. It was founded by Professor Dan Fennell Henderson in the early 1960s, shortly after he practiced law in Tokyo, Japan, for several years. For the first 2 decades, we were primarily a center on Japanese law. Our center has produced this nation's leading scholars on Japanese law, Professor Henderson, Professor John Haley, Professor Daniel Foote, and Professor Veronica Taylor. Since the 1980s, we added China in our teaching and research. Professor Don Clark has been the first faculty member specializing in Chinese law. So by the way, for those students, our center offers classes on both Chinese law and Japanese law in the winter quarter. We have an amazing team of faculty members, adjunct professors joining us in those 2 courses. So please join us in our winter quarter. So the title for today's lecture is Shifting the Pacific Triangle. This is of particular interest to us, having been involved in the study of both Chinese law and Japanese law. If you have been following the news, you probably can detect that in the after 2016, there's a lot of struggle on all these 3 countries, in Japan, in China, and the United States. If you were Japan, you'll be really facing this difficult choice. Premier Abe just visited China in late October. Japan has the political alliance with the United States, but Japan has more trade with China than she does with the United States. So is Japan shifting her position? What is the relationship? How does the relationship look like today? That's Professor Zhao will give us some important answer. So without further ado, Zhiqin.
Good evening. I'm Zhiqin Gao, President of the Committee on China-U.S. Dialogue. Welcome to the second event of our annual China-U.S. Dialogue lecture series. For students in this room, I would like to thank you all for making to the event during the dead week. So good luck on all of our finals. Dr. Zhao, you told me during the car ride that you've been to Seattle 36 years ago, so I would like to sincerely welcome you back to Seattle the second time. Our next two event during this winter quarter, we'll be hosting two senior scholars in the field. Dr. Nick Lardy, Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics and former Director of the Jackson School at UW, and Dr. Shi Yinhong, Professor of International Relations at Renmin University of China, and Counselor for the State Council of the People's Republic of China. Please follow us on Facebook or WeChat for updates and registration. So before I introduce our speaker, some housekeeping announcement first. Please silence your phones and please do not use any devices to record or any audio or video of this event without our permission. Please do not publish any public report of the event without the speaker's consent or our prior consent. As always, views expressed by the speakers do not represent our views or the views of the co-sponsors. So during the Q&A session, please do not raise any questions irrelevant to the event. We reserve the right to stop such activities when necessary, and any person violating any rules above will be held responsible based on relevant U.S. federal laws and rules and regulations of the state of Washington. For our second event, we're honored to have Dr. Zhao Quansheng with us. Dr. Zhao is Professor of International Relations and Director of Center for Asian Studies at American University in Washington, D.C. He is also a guest professor at Peking University, Tsinghua University, and Fudan University in China, and Korea University in Korea, and the coordinator for the Global Forum of Chinese Political Scientists. Professor Zhao received his PhD from the University of California at Berkeley and did his postdoc research at Harvard University. A specialist in international relations and comparative politics focusing on East Asia, Dr. Zhao is the author of Interpreting Chinese Foreign Policy and the other one titled Japanese Policymaking, both published by Oxford University Press. His books has been translated into Chinese, Japanese, and Korean. Dr. Zhao is a member of the editorial advisory board of the Journal for Strategic Studies, China Review, Hong Kong Journal of Social Sciences, Journal of Contemporary China, and Journal of Chinese Political Science. He has served as a member of annual peer review advisory panels for fellowships and research grants for the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, the United States Institute for Peace, the National Security Education Program, and the Fulbright Program, and as an external academic examiner for the City University of Hong Kong and National Chengchi University in Taipei. Dr. Zhao also testified on China's economic development at the United States Congress. Today, Dr. Zhao will provide us his analysis on the shifting between friends and enemies in U.S.-China-Japan triangular relations. Now, without further ado, please join me and welcome Dr. Zhao Quansheng.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's really delightful to be back here, Seattle. As Zhiqing mentioned, I was here 36 years ago. At that time, I told myself I'll be back, but it took me 36 years, so really grateful. Actually, upon arrival here, also we got together 3 Berkeley alumni, Professor Don Herman and Professor Rong-Chu Ha, and we sat down there and recall we shared mentor Robert Scalapino many, many years ago. Also delightful to see we have David Bachman here. Many, many years ago when I was at Berkeley, we were at the same, I guess, presentation when Dr. Bachman made. So, and at American University, we also invited Kenneth Pell, professor, is a Hansburg lecture, and give to us. I guess my colleague Milia Solis organized that activity. That was maybe 8 or 9 years ago. Really looking forward to both of you return to Washington, to American University. Actually, in my class, teaching Japanese politics and foreign policy, not once I used Professor Pell's book. So my student will be very happy to meet with both professors in Washington. Today, I was told that I should make quick because I should save some time for more Q&A. I prepared 44 pages slides, But I promise I will do quickly because I was told naturally the audience here very familiar with that part of history. So that part I would do quickly, and then I will watch, and definitely we'll finish before 4:55, as mentioned earlier. The topic here is the dynamics of U.S., China, Japan relations shifting between friends and enemies. The first line indicate the focus of this lecture, that is the three powers, what I said, the Pacific Triangle. And then the theme here, I would talk about what my understanding of the shifting relationship among the three powers. And then later, of course, I look forward to hearing comments and critics from our two Asian specialists, and among others with the student faculty here, have more discussion. If you look at here, the theme, of course, everybody familiar, quoted by Winston Churchill during World War II, is a nation has no permanent enemies and no permanent friends, only permanent interest. So national interest would play a key, what I would say, explanatory factor. But among others, I would also talk about, if you look at all those recent meetings, I didn't put the Argentina meeting yet, so you can see 2018. The presentation here, I would first make a comparison of the three powers, and then I would talk about the 5 factors of shifting and 8 historical conjectures and nature of the relationship, and then I will one by one talk about the different perspectives and move on for flashing points in East Asia, and then brings up a concept balancer, and then I would say uncertain directions of the triangle. The three powers, the importance of the three powers goes without saying. If we look at from economic terms, they combined constitute 47% of world economy. Military expenditure even more impressive. If we look at here, more than half the U.S., Japan, China. I'm not going to get into each country. But if we look at the population percentage, also equally impressive, and a quarter of the population, also the three powers. Of course, we all understand India is the second largest. The three powers in international economic, particular economic dimension, international community, also enormously active. If you look at this, it's a foreign direct investment. They move quickly, and if you make a comparison, either inflow or outflows is quite significant. At the same time, this is one point we have to pay attention. That is, the three powers closely interaction, what do we say, interdependence, which is very different from old-time Cold War. If you look at all three powers, let's say if you look at the top trading partners, Japan, that is United States and China, the top two. If you look at China, basically US and Japan, top two. If you look at United States, other than NAFTA, then it's China and Japan, top two. So those indicating all the three powers intertwined economically. Furthermore, if you look at the Treasury security holders, China and Japan, more than half. Actually, my students sometimes at American University raise hand. Even, right now is the final exam, I ask them, said, any questions? One of the students say, Professor, what would happen if the United States and China had a confrontation, then China decided to withdraw the money from the United States? So those are the questions, and also indicating, of course, my answer is not likely. So we will discuss later about current issues. So here, just give you the early reason, that is why we study the three powers, the changing relationships, because they are so significant to Asia Pacific and literally to the whole mankind. But before I move on, for my analysis of shifting friends and enemies, so what are the essential factors? So here is what my understanding. First, national interest, and that is very much to do with the priority setting. Second, power distribution. Sounds familiar because that's so-called school of realism. Really always talk about power distribution. And the third, alliance system. And the fourth, diplomatic opportunities, because that's also give idea. If you look at only the first three, you would say, well, all of those are so-called structural determinants. Politicians, political leaders, do they play a role? And the number 4 is that, yes, they constantly play active roles. And the fifth is international domestic linkage. That is to look at domestic issues. And here looks like something missing. For example, how do we see history? How do we see culture? How do we see ideological factors? I would say those factors, they are very important, but I put that as a category of what I call the residual factors. They're always there, the different culture, different history. So it's not really my focus, but that does not mean they are not important. They're also important. I would say that in my next analysis, I will talk more about, because national interest always there, like I mentioned earlier, but there are also other factors. Let me just quickly go one by one. What does it mean priority of national interest? That, to me, is very key factor to decide who are your friends and who are your enemies. If you look at national interest during Mao, the era of Mao, the idea is a revolution. Therefore, the foreign policy issues is so-called three-world theory. That is the whole world divided into first world, which is the two superpowers, United States and the Soviet Union. Third world, that is the developing countries. China was one of them. And the second world is Japan and West Europe, and would become target of try to so-called united front strategy. So because that's a revolution and making that kind of national priority setting decide who's enemy and who's friend. And then Deng Xiaoping, when he moved to power, open and reform. And the key word is modernization. In order to have modernization, what you need is capital, technology, and market. At that time, could the developing world provide those items? The answer is no. You have to switch to industrialized countries. That is United States, Japan, and West Europe at that time, together with 4 little dragons. So if you recall that time, that was what happened, drastically improved relations with those industrialized societies. Of course, it's not started from Deng Xiaoping. And Mao Zedong already started his improving relations with Japan and the United States. We will talk about that as well. If we look at Japan, top national interest, post-war, there are 3 D, I would say. Demilitarization, that produced Article 9, the peace clause, democratization, and development, led by Yoshida Doctrine. The second is power distribution. I still remember when I was teaching assistant 30-some years ago for Ken Waltz in his IR theory, and really emphasize this power distribution that could determine the attitude of powers toward each other. If we look at here, it's cooperation versus competition. Actually, cooperation and competition is a key word today for China and the United States. But if we look at here, Japan, if today we always say China rising, but in Asia Pacific, I always say the first rising power is Japan, and resulted in the first power transition of 1895, featured by Treaty of Shimonoseki, an economic miracle that really bring, later I will talk about this, and then move on for bubble to burst. That economic performance also had some influence over the country's relationship. Let's look at China. 100-year humiliation, very weak, and then open and reform. And then 2010 or 11, China replaced Japan, becoming number 2 economy. Those factors is what I call power distribution. Alliance system, we all understand in the post-war era, Cold War, we have 2 camps, communist camp, capitalist camp. Therefore, China allied with the Soviet Union, Japan with United States. Now it comes to the fourth one. The fourth one is very interesting. That is the political leaders, politicians. They could play a role. Look at the pictures. I always use the Korea Peninsula, the Pyeongchang Olympics with, look at the leaders when they get together maneuvering. Moon Jae-in, Kim Jong-un, Donald Trump. Those are very interesting. Of course, it's not all from those individual leaders, but it's very important for those leaders. They could play a role that ultimately or effectively stabilize, in a way, the Korean Peninsula. Later we will talk about. Of course, there are still much problems. At the early time, Nixon, Kissinger, Tanaka Kakue. So what I'm saying here is national leaders, they could also take the opportunities and facing challenges, play important role. The fifth factor, what I would say, is international and domestic. domestic issues is always critical. As we all understand, a classical saying, that is, foreign policy is an extension of domestic politics. This picture is familiar for those people who started teaching in the 80s. That is, took in Detroit, and the Detroit workers hammered down Toyota, Sony, and others. The question is, you steal jobs from us. We should bring jobs back to the United States. It's very similar to today, Donald Trump, you steal jobs from us. We should bring jobs back. So Japan bashing, because Japan was the economic rival in the 1980s, and then there was maneuvering. I had one article published recently about how domestic policymaking in Washington shift from Japan bashing to Japan first. And now the domestic debate is a China threat. So domestic issue is very critical as well. Now let's look at 8 junctures. This is what I call historical interactions. There are many, many ways to define Japanese foreign policy, and Professor Pyle is expert certainly in this direction. There are Japanese, American, and Chinese scholars studying this topic, some divided into 5 different periods. Some say 6, some say 11, some say 5. But my argument, based on the central theme, I would say 8 junctures. First, Opium War and Black Ships. Second, rise of Japanese Empire. And third, World War II. Fourth, Cold War. Fifth, common enemy. Sixth, Japan bashing. 7, end of the Cold War and China rising. And 8th, I use the term dual leadership or dual pillow system of the United States and China. Since this part of history, everybody familiar, I would go quickly so that we can later have more time, have more Q&A part. The first part is really a beginning. That is the United States interact with China and Japan as a part of what I say is a European powers intrusion, and actually not started with the United States. Is Great Britain at that time was the #1 power in the world, and China declined from the tributary system and declined. And then we can see 1842, the Treaty of Nanking, which marked the beginning of 100-year humiliation. United States followed, and the Treaty of Wanxia, later if we can talk about that, of course, is the starting point. For Japan, if we look at this map, from Norfolk, Virginia, and all the way to Tokyo, Commodore Matthew Perry in the 1853 thoughtfully opened Japan, which reflect the power distribution, that is the rise of United States. But Japan, if we look at from Meiji Restoration, 1868, that's the second juncture, I would say, is 1868 to 1931. That is Japan rising. It's very clearly. And because of that, China and Japan and China became victim. And Treaty of Shimonoseki, not only Taiwan, but also Korea Peninsula, ceded as a colony. And at that time, Japan, looking for the strongest power at that time, that was Britain. So Anglo-Japanese Agreement of 1902. And the target was against Russia at that time. Very interestingly, so now we are looking for two rising powers in Asia Pacific. One is Japan, one is the United States. How did the two get together? And here is very significantly, is the Taft-Katsura Agreement of 1905. Actually, this particular agreement divided sphere of influence. That is Manchuria, Korea Peninsula, Taiwan is a part of Japanese sphere of influence, whereas the Philippines is Japan acknowledged is America's sphere of influence. So that is very interesting. We see the interaction at that time. The third stage is World War II. From 1931 to 45, we all understand that part of history. Japanese continued to invade China, expanded from Manchuria all the way to the Nanjing Massacre, and furthermore attacked Pearl Harbor, right? So that is making the alliance system totally switched. That is, China and the United States form alliance against Japan. We all remember Flying Tigers and Burma Road. And their bombing of Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Tokyo Fair, and the war, Okinawa, and all the way to the Japanese surrender. So that is a very interesting period that the United States fighting together with China against Japan. But if we look at after the war, 45 to 1971, I said it's a Cold War. Of course, Cold War it would finish later. But here, what I'm saying, because the occupation of Japan, San Francisco Treaty, and early we also talk about, and Taiwan, KMT moved to Taiwan, and then the U.S.-China from an anti-fascist alliance to an ideological hostility. Those additional factors, other than national interest, we see domestic linkage, we see alliances playing key role. That's a very interesting number 5 juncture. The three powers from 71 to 78, they figure out there is a common enemy, that is Soviet Union. Then the three powers move close. With Tanaka Kakuai visited China, normalized relations, Nixon, Kissinger, and others, and there are so-called a mini honeymoon period. So alliance and diplomatic opportunity. The leaders playing a key role. One of the episodes of those leaders' function is so-called ping-pong diplomacy. We all understand that Nagoya, the Asian ping-pong game, table tennis. When Zhang Zedong met John, they got together and John said, the American player, we would like to visit Beijing. And the report sent to foreign ministry in Beijing. And the recommendation to the top leader is, the time not mature, we suggest reject. And Zhou Enlai read that report and saying, agree. And then the report moved to Mao. Mao looked at that, circle, didn't say anything. That means it's done. But we all understand that Mao didn't sleep, right? He worked in the night. So about 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, he asked the nurse to call Wang Hairong, and Wang Hairong is Mao's niece and deputy foreign minister at that time. And Mao asked Wang, was the report sent out? No. Change. We should invite American ping pong team to China. So that was how that happened. The ping pong team came to China. Zhou Enlai received it and sent a message to Kissinger and Nixon, and then that led to the. Of course, there are many other channels, but what I'm saying here, I use this example to say how important the leaders catching opportunities and to have a new and completely departing from old direction. 1978 to 1989 is an economic miracle and Japan bashing. I'm not going to, everybody familiar with that part. We already talked about the Detroit and Sony. Number 7, end of the Cold War, all the way 1989 to 2010, China rising. And for that part, China entered WTO and bypassing Japan, started another power transition and domestic linkage again, and the power distribution really played a critical role. Finally, the current stage, 2010 to present, China economy bypassed, North Korea nuclear crisis. It's not really Donald Trump. Obama already put forth a pivot to Asia project. So what the argument here is dual pillar in the Asia Pacific. That is security, militarily, majority powers countries relying on the United States. Economically, very much close to China, including Japan and South Korea, Southeast Asia, not to mention other economies such as Taiwan. So now after the 8 junctures and the 5 factors, let's look at different perspectives. The Washington perspective is no other powers can challenge. Therefore, there is Japan bashing to China threat and maintain power transition theory, hygiene, military alliance, and then finally make America great again. Tokyo perspectives stick to U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, but would like to return to Asia. Therefore, what my argument of Japanese foreign policy is what I call a tilted middle way foreign policy, which I also published as an article. By the way, the articles may be available so that for those of you interested. This is what I interact with some of the Japanese politicians. We had Murayama Prime Minister, Hatoyama, and either here in Washington or in Japan. Beijing's argument is very much concerned with 韬光养晦, keep low profile, versus 有所作为, that is to make some contribution, and China Dream and others. My argument is there are 3 perspectives: history embedded to national interest, to co-management, and the power transition. There are many other, and such as the Discord and others. Now, how the three powers handle current situation? So what I would say, there are historically two flashing points, and currently two new flashing points altogether. And if you use Chinese characters, that is Huanghai, Taihai, Donghai, Nanhai. Many of about half understand the character, but I would say Huanghai means Yellow Sea, that is Korea Peninsula. Taihai, Taiwan Strait. Those are the two more than a century-old flashing points. There are Donghai is the East China Sea, and Nanhai, South China Sea. Ongoing trade wars, we just now Xi Jinping and Donald Trump just met Saturday, and we will talk later. And international institutions, co-management of major powers, we have many, we have global, G7, G20, some say G2, but rejected by Washington and Beijing. There are many regional ones, ASEAN Plus 3, TPP 11 versus RCEP, Shanghai 6, and bilateral trade agreement, and trilateral summit, so-called CJK, China, Japan, Korea. Frequent summit, this is another phenomenon of this triangular relationship. If you look at Trump and Xi, right? Every year, in less than 2 years, they had extensive meeting already, but it's more extensive Trump and Abe, if you look at that. And then most remarkable visit is October 25th. Abe, in 7 years, the first prime minister visited is an official visit to Beijing. And in return, that Xi Jinping is scheduled to visit Tokyo if there's nothing happen then in next summer. We also pay close attention to the recent development. I'm now going to repeat Michael Pence's speech. And the point here is, what is U.S.-China relationship turning to? My argument is that you have to emphasize both competition and cooperation. I'm not going to repeat all those facts, but I give you one episode. In the National Day reception, October 1st, National Day, Ambassador Cui Tiankai delivered a speech a month ago emphasizing cooperation between the United States and China. Matthew Pottinger, the senior Asian Affairs Director, National Security Council, invited to that reception, and he delivered a speech. He specifically talked about competition. He even said competition is now the four-letter word, is a normally used language, so we'd better pay attention to. So my argument is that it seems like China side has very much emphasized cooperation, sometimes has wishful thinking that the two countries can avoid the confrontation. But at the same time, the U.S. side has too much emphasized competition and rival relationship, but ignored or overlooked the cooperative potential for the two sides. Therefore, we at American University last week, we had our own mini workshop and invited some scholars to discuss and the topic is U.S.-China relations, competition and cooperation. So those issues we need to have more discussion. And the U.S.-Japan alliance more important than ever at this point. Look at these two, Armitage and Joseph Nye. They had a conference at the CSS in Washington a couple of months ago using that as a topic. Therefore, and China and Abe Shinzo also meeting. So Japan, you can see a very interesting, and more importantly, Abe Shinzo expressed his tentative, not really, but still, so support of one belt, one road issue, but of course, still not joining AIIB. So, but moving on for lean toward, so that direction, that's what I call renormalization between China and Japan. And more importantly, look at the project. What they called is the third country project. And I give a name that is China-Japan plus one project. If you look at it, that means why should we have that much competition with third country like in Africa, in Asia, let's say in Thailand, in Indonesia, high-speed railway. You give the bid. You said, hey, I would have, let's say, $1 or $10 billion to build that railway. And then you would say, I would have $9 billion. I'm cheaper. And then the other would say, hey, I'm 8.5 billion. So that's what we say is this kind of a competition the two powers realized is not helpful. So now what they are going to do, they have a third-party project, third country, which of course is not easy. They already had some project is started. Therefore, the question of the Pacific Triangle, who is the balancer? First, Trump already made clear that is China and Russia are rebels. And then China had its own China dream. In this world, only United States has the capacity to stop. And Japan used to have an idea. We at American University, we have Center for Asian Studies, we inviting speakers. Professor Pell was one of them before, but we also invite diplomats, politicians. I remember a dozen years ago, we invited a Japanese diplomat to give a talk. And he looked around the room, he said, now I can give you internal Gaimushu, foreign affairs. We discussed. The conclusion is that no matter how much China raises, as long as we stick to 1+1, that is the US plus Japan, we will always be stronger than China, no matter what. Therefore, Japan has become a key in this triangular relationship, in this US-China rivalry relationship. This is also to explain why Joseph Nye and Armitage so much emphasized the importance of Japan, and why has China softened And Japan also softened its stance for that direction. Japan between U.S. and China. Actually, early time I had a meeting with 5, 6 students. We had a casual discussion, and one of the questions is that question: Japan between, and what Japan would do. Japan not exempted from U.S. tariff, and using tariffs, for example, steel, aluminum, to have bilateral free trade. And Japan coordinating response with the EU, and the emphasizing free and fair trade. Therefore, for Japan is a classical example of security versus economy, meaning security lean toward the United States and economy lean toward China. And this is not new, but it translates into policy. It would be very interesting, and that would, in reversed possibility, what I call 1 + 1 bigger than 1. And grid power management, we already talked about. In particular, look at this picture, Li Keqiang, Abe Shinzo, Moon Jae-in. So that's another development. Here is my summary of the 8 junctures and how those different elements played. I'm not going to get one by one. The conclusion is, I'm glad I made it within 55. The conclusion is 5 factors and 8 historical conjectures and nature of a relationship, and who is the balancer, uncertain directions, still uncertain. We have a what we call the global forum of Chinese political scientists. We have that organization. Every year, American Political Science Association, we organize 1 or 2 panels already for the past 2 decades. At the same time, we also have policy discussion every year with the Chinese Foreign Affairs Ministry. And thirdly, we also started what we call a global China online journal called 海外看世界. And the scholars, those items pretty much in Chinese discussion. The scholars from the United States, from Japan, from Taiwan, those are the 3 major parts. Each has about 2-3 dozen scholars together. We also have scholars from Hong Kong, Macau, Europe, Singapore, Australia, South Korea. So for those of you interested, if you have WeChat, you can pay attention to this, global China, and a lot of argument and analysis, and we all there. Thank you.
So Professor Zhao has given us an incredibly broad and lengthy, in terms of historical time covered, overview of the U.S., China, Japan triangular relationship. And I certainly am not going to take on many of those points. I'm going to concentrate on 3 or 4 related to contemporary events and some of the underlying principles that were in his talk. And I don't know that I have a particular order to discuss these in, but let me start with this idea that there's a triangle. We can talk about China's rise as a structural factor. We can talk about Japan's stagnation and demographic decline as a structural factor. We can talk about other things as a structural factor. But if we think about relations in Asia, international relations in Asia, over the last 17 or 18 years, the driving force has been North Korea. And in that sense, North Korea has in some ways defined the agenda much more than the United States, Japan, or the PRC. Similarly, South Korea is the U.S. ally with the largest military forces. It is the U.S. ally that spends, large U.S. ally that spends more of its GDP on defense than any other. And in that sense, it's not to be slighted here, as well as Taiwan as a driving force for the region. So there's a certain question about how important is this triangular view of U.S., Japan, China relations in the broader context of the international relations of Asia. So that's one point. The second is, in his talk, Professor Zhao was talking about 5 factors for the shifting of relations among the 3 major powers. And he talked about priority of national interest, power distribution, alliances, and then diplomatic opportunities and international domestic linkages. And he called the first 3 structurally determined, and I would challenge that. I would say that the priority of national interest or national interests are defined by national leaders and by national populations. They're the product of culture, history, to be sure, some sense of national security, but, and I'll lay this out in somewhat more detail in a minute, when many talk about national interest, they think in terms of realism. And I'm going to go through some aspects of China-Japan relations where I think we can distinguish between what a realist would do and what a nationalist informed by culture, century of humiliation, and other things has done. So think about China-Japan relations since 2009. So in 2009, the Democratic Party of Japan came to power. It was looking, or Prime Minister Harayama was looking for a more equal relationship between Japan, PRC, and the United States. The DPJ was opposed to U.S. military bases in Okinawa, wanted them moved out. Here was a perfect opportunity for China from a realist perspective to drive a real wedge in the U.S.-Japan relationship. China didn't take advantage of that opportunity. In 2010, you had the fishing boat incident in the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. The Japanese arrested a Chinese fisherman, seized his boat. China responded by escalating this, cutting back on rare earth elements. If China had handled this quietly through diplomatic channels, probably the fishing captain would have been released. You could have continued to see this as a way to advance Japan-China relations, as opposed to solidifying anti-Chinese feeling among Japanese public opinion and making it easier when the LDP, the Liberal Democratic Party, comes back to power in 2012 to push forward with ideas about revising Article 9. Similarly, with the purchase of 3 of the Diaoyu Senkaku Islands from private owners to the Japanese government, again, if China had played it lower key, had protested but not having real protest by Chinese people in the streets, not challenging militarily the Japanese presence there, one again could have imagined that you could have cut a wedge or tried to wedge between the U.S.-Japan relationship. And then you would have been in great shape in 2016 when Trump's elected and starts sort of complaining about a number of aspects of the U.S.-Japan economic relationship. Instead, China escalated in 2010, it escalated in 2012, it maintained its military presence and challenges around the Senkaku Diaoyu, and in that sense has convinced much of Japan that China is a threat. My third point then would be, or just to conclude that thought, that so it may be that China is driven by national interest, but that national interest is one that is not structurally determined. It's one that's a product of culture and one that makes it very difficult for Japan and China to fundamentally improve their relationship. Final point I want to talk about is the characterization of the period since 2010 as a period of U.S.-China dual leadership. And one could argue and suggest maybe it's a period of no leadership, particularly with both the United States emphasizing making America great again in a very selfish way, and where China's China dream seems to many to be fairly selfish itself. He characterized the U.S., this dual leadership system, as the U.S. providing security, China providing economic growth. And it's true that China is the biggest trading partner of almost every country in Asia. But many of those trades involve the sending of components to China where they're assembled and then re-exported. As my retired colleague Gary Hamilton has argued, what's driving this is the markets of the developed economies. That without the markets of North America, Western Europe, Japan itself, China's economic rise would have been much more limited. That it is not China that has all the leverage here. In fact, it is probably the United States. And on the economic side, we're still trading in dollars. The New York Stock Exchange is the center of global capitalism. All of these things suggest that while China's trade has grown very dramatically, the real name of the game is finance in the international political economy these days. And China has seen a big increase, as the figures in the graph suggested, but that the United States, by far and away, is the world's largest player in the international finance game. And the renminbi is a fraction of global exchanges, a fraction like 1% of global clearing of trade and other issues. So that while the trade aspect of China's role is quite important, what's driving that is the markets of the developed world more than anything else. And just to conclude that while I think the Trump administration has done some significant damage to the U.S.-Japan relationship, I suspect repairing that would be one of the easiest things that a post-Trump administration could do. So in that sense, I don't see there much potential for Japan to be a balancer, to be wooing away. I see Japan remaining a firm U.S. ally, even with the troubles that the Trump administration might cause. And with that, I'll just stop there.
I very much enjoyed my visit to American University a number of years ago, and as I told Professor Zhao, I came away deeply envious of the marvelous new building School of International Studies has on campus, a $35 million, I think, new building compared to Thompson Hall made me deeply envious. And when I mentioned that to Professor Zhao, he said, well, yes, Thompson Hall is a kind of traditional building. And I thought that was very nicely put. That's one way to put it. Professor Zhao's remarkably comprehensive coverage of triangular relations has given us an impressive tour de horizon of their triangular relations historical evolution. And he's shown us very clearly how changes in the balance of power have driven these constant shifts. And we're now entering a new and challenging era of these triangular relations. So let me, in the few minutes allotted to me, cut to the chase and make my main point which is that Japan is returning to great power politics and an activist role that we have not seen since 1945. Japan's return will have an opportunity to affect triangular relations, and as Professor Zhao suggested, may be a key toward the future shape of the triangle. Japan, during the Cold War, withdrew from great power politics, defined itself as a trading nation, and depended fundamentally on the United States to ensure its national security. To implement this strategy, Japan established a series of self-binding policies. I call them the 9 no's, the 9 negatives. My students say the pile's 9 no's. So these 9 no's are the following. During the Cold War, Japan had a policy of no overseas deployment of the self-defense forces, no participation in collective defense arrangements, no power projection capability, no nuclear arms, no arms exports, no sharing of defense-related technology with any other country, no spending of more than 1% of GNP for defense, no military use of space, and no foreign aid for military purposes. But since the end of the Cold War, Japan has responded to changes in the international environment by fundamentally revolutionizing its foreign policy. Driving this radical change are 4 factors which I think have been critically important. First of all, there's been relentless pressure from the United States to do more for their own security if the alliance is to last in the post-Cold War period. Second, of course, is the rise of China. Third is the belligerence of North Korea. And fourth is a rightward shift in Japanese domestic politics. The collapse of both the Japanese Socialist Party and the collapse of the Yoshida School of Politics, which adhered to a trade-oriented foreign policy, leaving the right wing of the Liberal Democratic Party overwhelmingly dominant. So Abe Shinzo has been a key to the revolution in Japanese foreign policy, which he has carried out from, I'd like to say, from above, that is, by the elite, in spite of the continuing but increasingly diminished public opposition to a more activist foreign policy. So to illustrate that, of the 9 no's, the 9 negative policies, all but one of those 9 are now gone, leaving only the nuclear option unchanged. And that itself is under constant surveillance and discussion. So Japan is pulling free from all its Cold War constraints, its post-war constraints. Most significant in the Abe revolution, if you want to call it that, is the 2015 reinterpretation of the Constitution. A reinterpretation of the Constitution to allow for collective defense. And together with that, that made possible revision of the U.S.-Japan defense guidelines, which followed very closely on that revision of the Constitution, allowing in the alliance, allowing for greater integration of forces, interoperability, and expanded geographical scope of cooperation between the U.S. and Japan, making the alliance more operative and maintaining a balance of power as Chinese military power rapidly expands. Together with those developments, Abe has put in place the infrastructure of political strategic institutions necessary for a more activist foreign policy. He's created a National Security Council for the first time, a national security strategy, which Japan had never had before. It's begun intelligence gathering capability, and so on. Together with all of those developments, Abe's personal initiatives as a more activist foreign policy leader. The really signature policy initiative of his is what is sometimes called the Quad, which he envisioned, and he first articulated this in 2007 in an address to the Indian Parliament. The Quad, in Abe's view, would bring together the United States, Japan, Australia, and India. And this is something which he calls the Indo-Pacific Security Framework, and he has pushed that with Trump on their recent meetings. He's also continued to pursue closer relations with Russia. In spite of all kinds of obstacles, that remains a high priority of his. And most ironically, his activism has shown up recently in picking up on U.S. withdrawal from TPP and trying to restore TPP with considerable success without the United States. And so we're very close to having a TPP 11 absent the United States, thanks in great part to Abe's initiative. So there's an ironic twist here. Abe was thought by many to be a right-wing revisionist ideologue when he came to power, an arch-conservative, but he's positioned himself as a leader of the liberal order, appropriating liberal rhetoric as a way of crafting a kind of new national identity for Japan as a regional democratic leader over against authoritarian China. Now, in this reemergence of Japan as an activist player in great power politics, I think both China and the United States have abetted this. As Professor Bachman said, China, I think, made a great mistake by its anti-Japanese nationalism, its haranguing on history issues, the whole issue of the islands in the East China Sea, not to mention the South China Sea. China really went against its own national interest in that. They could have driven, as Professor Bachman said, a wedge between the United States and Japan with a more perceptive foreign policy. As for the United States, Trump, most recently by his abandonment of TPP and his strident nationalist agenda, has raised uncertainty about the durability of the alliance. And from here on, Japan, while doubling down on the alliance, will at the same time monitor very closely the future course of American foreign policy in terms of their own national interests. An agreement, for example, between Trump and North Korea that leaves out Japan's national interests would raise real red flags for Japan. So in the short term, there's no question Japan will double down on the alliance with the U.S., but in the future, I would expect that Japan will pursue a more national foreign policy, leaving room for greater latitude of pursuing Japan's own particular national interests. So to conclude, Japan does have major problems which get a great deal of attention internationally. Things like the aging society, its sluggish economy, its national debt, its labor shortage. But it also has other advantages too. It has none of the populism of other democracies. Rather, it has a one-party democracy on the whole, which is much more cohesive than other democratic political systems in the world today. It has a strong communitarian impulse. There's nothing like the polarization in Western democracies. There's less of the wealth discrepancies and disparities. The political opposition in Japan today is weaker than it's been in the entire post-war period. So in this respect, Japan is becoming a quite different country than the one we have known for the last 70-some years. And Abe has begun restoring Japan's responsibility for its own security, making the U.S. alliance more reciprocal, and launching an activist policy not seen since 1945, and going forward, giving it a considerable opportunity to influence triangular relations. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
We will allow 5 minutes for Professor Zhao's response and then take questions.
Thank you, Professor Bachman and Professor Pyle. It's really wonderful to hear from you. And as I mentioned, actually, I sent some of my early published articles to the professors here and asked for comments and feedback because it's a larger book project. And so I'm happy to hear the comments. And particularly when Professor Pell used a word, comprehensive. It's when we say comprehensive, of course, I'm happy to hear that, but at the same time, it's difficult to be comprehensive because there are so many factors got involved. We have to study, we have to figure out. Maybe I combine the two remarkable comments. I would make 4 or 5 points here. Actually, let's raised a few questions here. I guess if we can say one for China, one for Japan, and one for U.S., and from how we should understand those questions. First, for China. China rising does not mean China would not make a mistake. China has been making mistakes just like any other great powers. For example, I fully agree that during, Hatoyama only served for 8 months, very short time. And he used like equal distance diplomacy, meaning Japan maintain equal distance with China and the United States. He also talked about removing U.S. military base not only from Futama, but also but also move from not Hawaii, move from Okinawa. And finally, he also proposed a so-called East Asia summit without the United States. All those are really very bold suggestions in the very short period. And the suggestion that China should make this opportunity, well, I would say yes or no, because I was also in the process working in Japan. Indeed, that's one of my own criticism, that Chinese foreign policy, in a way, too rigid, too bureaucratic. Actually, during that time, in one of, we have a group of scholars visiting Foreign Affairs Ministry, and one of the visits was with the Japan desk chief there. And the question is, Hatoyama, proposed East Asia community and proposed those questions. Why should China have no response, no positive response? And the answer was, well, actually, Japan's motivation is for competing leadership in the region. And also saying that proposal, no substance, only a slogan. So you can tell at that time how the Chinese bureaucrats, they were debating among themselves, struggling about this new phenomena. But obviously, with only 8 months and very short, the window opportunity, that's what I sometimes talk about in diplomacy. So I agree with Professor Bachman that indeed, I think China, this diplomatic opportunities arrives sometimes making a mistake. They couldn't, of course, I myself, I fully agree that the role of leadership is very critical. It's not really structure determined. There are many rooms for diplomatic maneuvering. The second question is about Japan. My own argument, I guess, is a bit bold. That is, Japan is a balancer. I understand majority Asian specialists, including Japanese scholars themselves, say, no. They would fully agree with Professor Bachman, say Japan would never move toward China, would stick to U.S.-Japan alliance, which, of course, is the current status, is no matter what happened. Michael Green, as early as 3 years ago, we had at the CSIS, a Japan specialist, about more than a dozen scholars, we get together for lunch. And in the end, Michael asked a question, say, don't leave. I conduct an informal poll. For those of you who think when China getting stronger and stronger, Japan would lean toward China, please raise your hand. And for those of you who believe Japan would not move, please raise your hand. You know, you can see already. No. I'm not asking here. I'm saying Michael Green asked. We know who's Michael Green, right? So in other words, this question actually very much in Washington's mind. Only 2 people raised hand at that time, saying Japan would move, lean toward China if that situation happened. That's myself and Warren Cohen, the East Asia historian. Others, about a dozen others, about half actually, they are Japanese scholars. They say, no, Japan will not. So I would say, Professor Bachman, you're in majority. I know that. But I still raise that question from my own understanding. There is a lot of stories. I'm not going to say, hey, look at Abe Shinzo, he's moving. Not really, he's really hygiene policy. It's not, I would say it's not yet. So the situation continue to evolve. That comes to the third, that is United States. What U.S. should do? Again, under Trump administration, I don't think anyone can think about. But since we are scholars, we may think about unthinkable issues. When Xi Jinping and Abe Shinzo talk about the third country project, that is Japan and China cooperate, work with the third country. Of course, it's pretty much talk about infrastructure, talk about one Belt, one Road, talk about AIIB related issues. Well, Japan is not joining AIIB yet, but Japan already said would like to be part of one Belt, one Road. So the question to Washington, eventually, Washington may also think about why China and the United States cannot work together on this kind of a third country project. Actually, under Obama, China and the United States already add one more item in their comprehensive strategic dialogue, that is Asia-Pacific project, meaning the United States and China will discuss the third party. I know Japan was a bit concerned, worried about that. Finally, I would say a few more words about Japan. Actually, in China, ongoing and heated debate about what exactly Japan's location and status. Some of Chinese diplomats argued that Japan is such loyal follower of the United States. That was at the early stage when Koizumi repeatedly visiting Yasukuni Shrine, and also after that, other questions like the Sangaku-Diaoyu dispute and others. The argument is that China, if there is a problem with Tokyo, China should not go to Tokyo. Instead, China should go to Washington. It's almost like now, if any question about Taiwan, China should come to Washington to settle the Taiwan issue. Therefore, the argument is Japan is no longer a major power. I disagree. Not only because I myself, one of the research focus is on Japan, but also you have to look at it objectively. And Japan, indeed, is always a major power. And there are actually even a discussion among Japan specialists. One of the scholars, for example, argue, actually there is no lost decades, no lost 2 decades. Japan's economy continued to be strong. Of course, that's disputable. A lot of discussions over that. So comes to my own article, that is Japan's tilted middle way foreign policy. That version published in Chinese 日本学刊, the Journal of Japan Studies of Social Science Academy, and recently published in Seoul-based journal called Asian Community. The article available in English. So for those of you interested, I would really happy if you can give feedback to those articles. I guess I'd better stop here, for more questions. Thank you.
All right, we'll take questions. So we have 2 mics on each side, and please, because of the time, let's refer to your question as a question. We don't want to hear your monologues, so please. Yes.
So that we take notes. That would allow more available questions. Yeah.
And please address your question to specific speakers. Thank you.
Okay, I guess I have 2 questions, kind of related. I'm in Professor Bachman's class, so he knows that I'm not really a big fan of the realism theories. The reason being, we place a lot of emphasis on power transition, so the rising power versus the incumbent power. But rarely, if ever, do we actually mention other aspects like, for example, like violation of human rights. Because when we're talking about national securities, we're not really talking about, because I'm more sort of like interested in human security. So I would like to hear your opinions, like any of the professors. And the second question is, I think we have mentioned lots of the importance of leadership. And the Chinese leadership, despite being called communists, is really like extreme right. I would even go so far as calling them fascists. And now we see that it's just not just China, but the rest of the world has been sort of like moving in the direction to the right, like including the U.S. and Japan. So do you think that it would actually increase the risks of, even more severe conflicts and the confrontation?
Maybe more questions? Yeah, we can collect, yeah.
I'd like to take you off in a little different direction. Professor Zhao started us that way. What about, we've been talking today entirely in terms of the triangular relationship between and among the 3 countries. What about also talking about the competition between these countries in the 3rd countries? In Southeast Asia, Japan is, ever since the East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere saw South Asia as an important part of its economic realm. And China is really looking all over the world, not just the central stands, but also South Asia and South America, and amazingly, Africa to a very large extent. The United States seems to simply say, well, we'll let our businesses do all of that, and the government just kind of stands aside and doesn't do much of anything. I wonder if I could get you all to talk a little bit about this relationship of the 3 powers with respect to other parts of the world, and whether or not they're competing or whether they're sort of saying, well, leave that part of the world to the other powers, et cetera, et cetera. So if you could address the competition in other parts of the world.
All right, Professor Bachman, you mentioned that Donald Trump, this administration, has done serious damage to the Japanese-U.S. relationship, but a new administration would have an easier time to potentially fix that. I guess my question, I'm curious for maybe all 3 of you to address this. Do you think that the current Chinese and Japanese administrations take Donald Trump's policies and his actions seriously? And also, do you think if a new administration were to come in and try to undo what Donald Trump has done, do you think that Donald Trump's actions would have kind of be a cloud over a future administration and how they view the U.S. Relationship? Thank you.
Professor Zhao, thank you for the very nice lecture, and I enjoy the comments from my colleagues too. So my question, I want to follow Professor Bachman's question that the presentation of China being part of the triangle, the very notion of triangle, seems to be based on inflated notion of China being one of the pillars of the world. In the meantime, seems observers of Chinese politics are having a hard time in detecting where the leadership China offers to the world. Leadership in the different areas of pressing issues in the world we are facing today. One is climate change. Where is China's leadership on climate change issues, on trade? So now country is talking about the reform of the WTO. I know the Ministry of Commerce in China also has certain positions, but where is China's leadership in reforming the world trading structure we are facing? Also, Professor Pyle's question that if not only that China makes mistakes to Japan, I wonder if those are genuinely mistakes or more strategic or inherent hostility to Japan. So in that sense, it may not be a mistake at all, but rather a continued hostility to Japan, which leads to the question that how does China convince Japan to move closer, right? So if you are among those experts who believe that given the right conditions, China may decide to move closer to Japan may decide to move closer to China, but then what China can do, what China is able to do to make it more attractive for Japan, right? And the last one would be the legal field, that given China's behavior in South China Sea and the response to the arbitration decision on South China Sea, China seems is not offering or refuse to offer any leadership in the rule of law in the global community. So in that sense, why should Japan trust China to provide any leadership? So in that sense, are we in the real world that without leadership, that Trump is not providing any leadership? Japan has not, but neither is China, right? So in all those major issues, so in that sense, are we inflating the image or the impact of China in talking about triangle?
All right, we have time for one or two more questions.
Okay, so this question is kind of more for Professor Zhao, and like in the case that Japan does really decide to move closer to China, and I think other audience members have already asked similar questions, but like more specifically, do you think, because there is like a very deep-rooted historical sort of animosity between China and Japan, and is, and it's very venomous, and a large part of it, the Chinese government leadership itself is actively pushing for a very nationalistic agenda. Do you think, in the case that Japan does decide to move closer to China, do you think the current Chinese administration, the leadership under Xi Jinping, would be willing to sort of retract their nationalist agenda, and like more like embrace Japan?
Shall we? Yeah. So I go first? Yeah, okay, thank you. Okay. Maybe we just sit here. Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah, those are very wonderful questions. Let me just quickly, if I can, I would say number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5. There are 5 questions. Number 1, about leadership would move to conflict. Indeed, I agree. Leadership playing important role. That if we look at the Kim Jong-un and Trump administration and others, there are very much. If we look at how dramatic Korea Peninsula from April to summer and then to now, it's like a cold, icy relationship, and moved to, according to Trump, my good friends of Kim Jong-un. So, it's very dramatic. So I would say certainly play important role. And the second question about the third party. Indeed, actually I did spend time talk about the third party, and this is also the project Abe Shinzo visited Beijing, and they produced one of the outcomes is so-called third-party project. And they specifically talk about the project not only in Africa, but in Thailand and others. The third-party factor is always important. As Professor Bachman earlier mentioned, the Korea factor. The Korea factor, of course, Korea Peninsula, like I used the word of historical and traditional flashpoints. Ever since, if we see modern history, if not, we don't trace back to like a Tang Dynasty and others. Ever since Treaty of Shimonoseki and Korea Peninsula remained as a central conflicting point in East Asia politics. Russia, Southeast Asia, those all very important. I fully agree. This should be an important project for us to study. The third question asks about whether if U.S., Japan, actually is asked for Professor Bachman, that is how easy or how difficult the next administration would fix the U.S.-Japan friction, if there is any. It's not new. Remember I talked about Japan bashing. One of the strengths of U.S. foreign policy is a self-correction. If there are previous administration making mistakes, the next administration may make a correction. That happened many, many times. If we look at the Iraq War, and same thing with Japan bashing. In my other article, we discussed extensively about how the intellectuals making that correction. Professor Zhang asked about, again, the question how China could actually, together with the number 5 question, is that is so much resentment among Japanese ordinary people toward China. If you look at the opinion poll, it's more than 80% negative. China, actually, if we look at the current tourism booming, China's positive response increased. I guess now from like 20-some to 30-some and to 40-some is more positive than the Japanese popular reaction. So my answer is that when I make that argument, that is Japan may have a tilted foreign policy, is a long evolutionary process. I'm not saying Japan already lean toward, but we're talking about the future possibilities so evolved into that direction. Of course, China need much to do. And China actually and Japan, there is another huge debate within Chinese foreign policy communities, that is whether Abe Shinzo this time visit Beijing is a strategic move or only a technical move. I don't think there is a clear answer yet. Is like I said, it's still, but another important factor between Japan and the United States, I would say two important factors, and China is far behind, is people-to-people diplomacy between United States and Japan is much deeper now. It's much layered. If you look at the culture, the other factors, that's number one. Number two, the influence and even control of the United States over Japanese politics and even society is such deep. It's not easy to weaken. And China has no such influence over internal society of Japan. Those two factors, I think, would last for a long time. I don't think there would be any illusion that China would catch up. Nevertheless, there would be a long developing, particularly if China continue and in terms of economic growth. Of course, that's a huge if. We have to see. I'd better stop here, yeah.
Let me try and run through these quickly. So question about human security, that on the UN's Human Development Index, Japan and the United States rank quite highly. China has moved up very rapidly. So in that sense, there's not a huge issue there. Now, when we move away from life expectancy, education, and health access, and get into things like human rights and other things, then it gets much more controversial. But when we're talking about countries, we often make this shorthand, talk about leaders and national interest as opposed to human development, and I'd be happy to talk about human development or human security after the talk. About your point, Aaron, about the moving to the extreme right, one consequence of that is that countries are becoming more nationalistic, and it's a narrow-minded nationalism, a self-interested, a narrowly defined nationalism, which makes international cooperation and leadership more difficult, which speaks to Dongsheng's question about where is the Chinese leadership? Well, to the extent that China is more nationalistic under Xi Jinping, or even since 1989, that makes China exercising the kind of sort of broadly appealing provision of public goods type of leadership on general principles much more difficult. In terms of the triangular competition question, I'd say, look, that there can be areas where China and Japan and even the U.S. can cooperate, but that's at the level of countries. United States really has fewer assets in some ways to direct companies to act, although the recent BUILD Act gives the United States government the ability to ensure and to, in effect, subsidize foreign activities by U.S. corporations. But there are Chinese multinationals, Japanese multinationals, U.S. multinationals out there looking for markets, looking for opportunities. Some of them are loosely coordinated by the governments, others are not. So we have this very complex game of countries, companies, actors involved around the world looking for opportunities, looking for profits. So there's some potential for cooperation, but these multinationals are also competing against each other, so competition is built into this. About the question about does Japan and China, do Japan and China take Trump seriously? Absolutely. The tariffs matter to them. Access to the U.S. market matters to them. They may not like it. They may not like what Trump stands for is doing, but absolutely they have to take Trump seriously. Now, they know to some extent what to discount and what to take seriously. And certainly for China, in fact, you could make the argument that Trump is softer on China than is the so-called U.S. deep state, which is coming to a conclusion, as we heard with Robert Tucker a couple of weeks ago, that in fact it's a whole of government view that China is a rival, a competitor, a threat to U.S. national interests. In terms of the next administration dealing with with Japan to restore things, take the tariffs off steel, take the tariffs off aluminum, don't say the automobile industry is a potential national security threat, and so on. All of those are things that I think wouldn't be very difficult to take care of. And then about, Japan moving closer to China, could the Chinese government actually embrace this, take actions to do it? I do have a master's student who's made the argument that since 2012, there haven't been any public protests against foreign countries. And that is interesting in the way that the Chinese government seems to be trying to manage nationalism, to keep it constrained, and so on. So it's not inconceivable if you could make certain kinds of promises to what would come from Japan, a closer Japan-China relationship, about how that could be managed. Whether the Japanese people and the government would find that credible is an open question.
Well, just a few comments. The first questioner asked about, raised the issue of security for human rights. For the last 100 years, there have been three fundamental principles, foreign policy principles that have guided American policy toward East Asia. The first principle was really enunciated by Theodore Roosevelt, and that was the balance of power, maintaining the balance of power and ensuring that no one country, other than the U.S., dominate the East Asia region. Secondly is keeping the region open to free trade. That's the open door, John Hay. And the third principle was promoting democracy, Woodrow Wilson. Promoting democracy is the surest way to a peaceful regional order. The interesting thing is that Trump has basically abandoned that third principle of promoting democracy and human rights. And to that extent, that plays really right into Xi Jinping's hopes for the future and not to be challenged in terms of human rights. A second questioner asked about the relation of the three powers to other parts of the world. I think it's been very interesting to observe, for example, the growing closeness between Japan and India. There's a great economic complementarity there. And the interesting thing about India for Japan is that there are no history issues involved. In fact, quite the contrary, Indian nationalists always sympathized with Japan's wartime policies. Also, Japan, of course, has paid a great deal of attention to Southeast Asia, as the questioner mentioned. A third point, can China do something to draw Japan closer? I would turn that around just a little bit and say that the U.S. has a great deal to say about this. That is, if the U.S. alliance loses its credibility with Japan, that would do a great deal to draw Japan closer to China. That brings to mind something that the Harvard political scientist Sam Huntington said in the aftermath of the end of the Cold War. When he was in Japan, a reporter asked him, what should Japan do if the U.S. pulls back from maintaining the balance of power in Asia? And Sam Huntington's response, forthright response was, well, if the U.S. pulls back from maintaining the balance of power in East Asia, I would recommend that Japan cut a deal with China. Very interesting. I think that's what I have to say. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for coming. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Zhao Quansheng, for his successful lecture. And thanks our discussants, Professor Pyle and Professor Bachman. So I thank all of you for being here. And this is the last event of this quarter. And starting from next quarter, we'll be having 2 more events. So our event on next quarter will be inviting Dr. Nicholas Lardy, who is a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute of International Economics. He is also a former faculty member and the director of the Jackson School of International Studies here in UW. So the title of his topic will be "The State Strikes Back: The End of Economic Reform in China," and we hope to see you there by then, January 24th. Thank you.